Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started with our webinar today. Thanks for joining. My name is Mike Centetos. I'm the Policy Director for ITS Davis's SB1 Research Program. I'm going to moderate the webinar today. We're going to be hearing from California's Department of Housing and Community Development about 2 new housing data sets that they're going to present on. This webinar is organized by the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, and Laura Podolsky, who couldn't be here today, in coordination with the California Department of Housing and Community Development and the Mineta Transportation Institute at CSU San Jose. We're not going to go around and do introductions just because we had a pretty lengthy registration list. So we did send out the registration list if you want to know who else is on the webinar and who you're going to be hearing questions from later today. For our agenda, I'll just do a quick overview. We're going to start with a presentation from HCD staff about 2 data sets that will provide a better understanding of where people are or will be living in California. And then we're going to have plenty of time for discussion. I think we're hoping this is going to be a kind of a 2-way street. I know HCD is interested in hearing from the research community about the types of research questions you're thinking could be informed by these data sets. Certainly want to give you all time for questions about aspects of the data sets that you're interested in. I'll mention it again as we transition into our Q&A, but you do have 2 options for asking a question. If you want to type it in, we have a little Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar platform at the bottom toolbar. Just open it up and you can type your question in at any point during the presentation. Or if you'd rather ask your question over the phone, we can do that too. We're just going to ask you to use, there's a little raise hand icon that's also on the bottom of the screen. And we'll just ask you to just click that. That'll let us know that you want to ask a question. And then we'll go through and call on you just to kind of keep things in order and moving along quickly. So with that, let's get right to our presentation. We're going to hear from a couple different speakers at HCD. The first one is going to be Sasha Wysotsky, who's the Data and Research Manager with HCD's Housing Policy Team. So Sasha, I will turn it over to you.
I am Sasha Wysotsky-Kurgan. I'm the manager in the Housing Policy Team here at HCD. I want to thank everybody for joining us on the call today, and particularly thank UCITS for hosting. A big thanks to Laura, who's not on the call, who's really instrumental in keeping the momentum up for this webinar. On the call today, you'll hear from a few more people in the room. We'll do quick introductions and talk about what we're each presenting.
I'm Harry Annixter. I'm also on the Data and Research Team. I work for Sasha.
Hi, this is Tom Brinkheis. I'm also on the Data and Research Team, and I will be talking a lot about the APR and the form, and HCD's primary contact for the APR and for providing technical assistance and helping to fill it out.
Great. So as Tom mentioned, we'll mainly be talking about the housing element and sites inventory today. But a quick overview of our presentation. We'll give a little bit of background just so you can understand kind of who we are and why we're doing this work. And so we'll do that by talking about our data and research team, and then a really brief background on housing policy. We're going to try and distill a lot of information in one slide, and talk about some recent changes, really all to introduce you to the focus of our talk today, the data that's in the housing element annual progress reports, and the data that will be in the housing element sites inventory. We'll talk about some current uses for annual progress report data and potential use cases of this information. But like you heard in the introduction, we're really holding some time to hear from you, to get your thoughts, to get your questions, and then we'll wrap up. I'll share some closing remarks on the call, or at the end of the call. Okay, a little bit about, I'm going to try not to use too many acronyms here, but the Housing Policy Development Division and our Data and Research Team. We have a really dynamic portfolio that is a good problem to have. We collect and analyze data. We'll talk about that today. We do a good bit of work seasonally on legislative analysis, and then we're part of the first responders team on implementation. We're responsible for using data to make determinations, some that limit local land use restrictions, all to further the development of housing. And then some of our new projects relate to using public lands, both state-owned property and local-owned property for affordable housing development. This is a really exciting new part of our work. And here, when I say local agencies, it's really broadly defined. So it even includes special districts and transit agencies that are now required to make surplus land available for affordable housing. Through it all, there's a lot of interdepartmental coordination with other state departments and agencies. That's how we came to know Laura through some of our housing and transportation work, but a lot of other projects relate to housing. We also do lots of intra-departmental work as well. So while we'll share our contact information today, please do feel free to use it. Our team is often help kind of finding the way within HCD to connect with other people that may help you. Here we've listed the other divisions, which are in our housing policy team. That's land use and planning, kind of what our division was most known for, and the review of housing elements through some of the legislation that I'll talk about next. We've had to expand, and so now we have a unit focused on fair housing and access to opportunity. We have a policy and program support unit that really leads on most of our interdepartmental work, but we also have other divisions at HCD, which is the Division of Financial Assistance and the Division of Codes and Standards. So depending on who you are and what kind of research you've done to date, you may have experienced some work with the department. Our data and research unit was formed in part because of the expansion of our responsibilities with new legislation, and our team continues to grow. We have some recruitments out now and some coming soon. Please feel free to talk to me if you have ideas. Okay, here's housing policy in a nutshell in hopefully less than 2 minutes. Going outside of our department, this element of housing policy is really significant for our talk today. Suffice to say, there's a lot of attention on housing, and specifically the housing crisis. And over the past few years, we've gained the attention of the legislature. And there have been significant legislative changes to address the housing crisis in our state. The 2017 housing package was signed by Governor Brown and brought more than 15 new bills, all focused on housing. The work didn't stop there, continued with the 2018 ledge cycle, and then with the 2019 inauguration of Governor Newsom, this brought even more attention and focus on housing through legislation, executive orders, and expanded funding. Through it all, there's been a real focus on bringing new funding to support housing development and local planning to facilitate housing development. A huge multifaceted push to accelerate or to streamline housing development. Meanwhile, a new charge to hold local governments accountable for following the law. And then last, a focus to preserve the affordable housing that we already have, which we would refer to here as preservation. Now, we're not going to do a bill-by-bill analysis here, but just want to include some citations of specific bills that expanded HCD's authority in context of data. The Housing Element Annual Progress Report is something that seems to be very popular these days, and 3 recent bills, AB 879, SB 335, and AB 1486, all brought changes to the Housing Element Annual Progress Report. The sites inventory came with some new authority in SB 6, and then the data strategy, which was called out in last year's AB 1483. So while the APR and the sites inventory will help us understand where housing is planned, permitted, and built, the data strategy gives us the opportunity to kind of pause and reflect, to think about the data priorities that the department has and that the state should have, the ways in which we collect and manage information about housing, and then how we communicate with localities, and a lot more. So through these legislative changes, we also got new authority to use data to make determinations that will limit local development restrictions. That showed up in SB 35, that's Senator Wiener's flagship land use bill, and then SB 330 from Senator Skinner in last year's legislation, again, limiting certain zoning related actions depending on either local action or if you're a census designated place. All of that information is on our website. We linked it and you should be able to access it from the PDF. This is just an example. We'll show this slide again a little bit later, but this is just to put all those last words and bills into context. This is just a sample of how we visualize the annual progress report data in a map. This is a snapshot of the SB 35 map. which actually is beyond what we were statutorily required to do. But instead of giving a data table, we decided to visualize the information for each city and county. You can see their progress in meeting their regional housing need. You can also see their housing element compliance status and more. So we'll talk a lot about annual progress reports today and some of the data coming through the site inventory. Both of those are connected to housing elements, which is just one element of the general plan. I realize we have a lot of transportation researchers on the phone, some other folks that are more focused on housing. We're happy to have longer conversations, but next up, we're gonna get right into Tom talking about the annual progress report.
Hi, yeah, this is Tom Brinkheis. Yeah, just wanted to go over the APR and familiarize you guys with the form as it stands today. So just to go back, you know, and give you kind of a bigger picture, cities and counties are required to report on their general plan every year. They're required to submit the state a report submitted to HCD and OPR on the implementation of their general plan. And the housing element, of course, is one element of their general plan. And there are actually some separate requirements for reporting on your housing element. It gets a little more detailed in statute what you need to report on. And so in 2017 and prior, so before the housing package passed and a few of those bills that Sasha just mentioned, the APR required a few things. It required reporting on the building permits that your jurisdiction issued, and a report on your housing element programs. And that was pretty much it. And a lot of the reporting was sort of not project specific, so you just reported on the bulk number of building permits that you issued. But that all changed with the housing package. The legislature put a lot more requirements into the APR form as far as what jurisdictions had to report on. So in addition to building permits, it required basically a report out on the whole housing development pipeline. So that is basically from the receiving of an application for residential development all the way through the issuance of a certificate of occupancy. Jurisdictions are required to report on every step. So that's, you know, applications, units that you've entitled, units that you've issued building permits for, and then units that you've issued certificates of occupancy for. And so with the new requirements, it really required HCD to redesign the form to incorporate all of these new requirements. And so, you know, we undertook you know, an effort to basically redesign everything from the ground up. Included a bunch of new tables. Everything that you see in red is a new requirement for the form. So you can see table A, brand new table tracking every application for residential development that the jurisdiction has received. Table A2 now includes entitlements and certificates of occupancy in addition to building permits. Table B is the report on your RENA progress. That was in the old form too. Sorry, RENA. RENA, RHNA stands for the Regional Housing Need Allocation. Sorry for the acronym. It's basically the planning goal that jurisdictions are required to, you know, update their housing element to show that they can accommodate. We have Table C, which is a report out on sites that you've rezoned. Tables D and E were also in the old form. Those include report on your programs and then a report on units that have been rehabilitated. And then Table F and Table G are both new. Table F being if your jurisdiction has approved a project using a commercial development bonus. And table G is any report out on a locally owned site that was in your housing element, but has since been disposed of. So you can see that, you know, just generally a lot of requirements for these jurisdictions, you know, to address in their reporting. That means a lot of data for us. I'll just outline real quick also that with the redesign of the form, we also redesigned our system of taking in all this data. And so, you know, the old form, a lot of forms were submitted to us incomplete. They had missing fields, you know, things like addresses or parcel numbers or whatever, you know, they weren't always completed. They weren't always included. But with the new form and our new system, everything that is required must be completed for us to be able to accept the form. So we designed this whole, you know, database where users can upload the form into our database, and, you know, if all the required information is there, then it accepts it. If some is missing, then it rejects it. So, you know, you might not use the system yourself, but it's just, it's good to be aware that, you know, for us, this means, you know, a much more robust data set, which, you know, has been, you know, fully sort of completed by these jurisdictions, and, you know, everything that's required is in our database. So this is sort of a view of what our form looks like. You can see a lot of fields, a lot of columns, you know, big spreadsheets in Excel. Like I said, table A is your housing development applications. So, you know, in our tables, we capture the parcel number of, you know, where the application is proposed to develop residential units, the street address, the, you know, other information like a project name or tracking number. Some of these fields are optional, but the APN, the address, those are required. The unit category, so whether or not it's a multifamily project, single family, an accessory dwelling unit, that's required for the jurisdiction to complete. The tenure of the project, if they know if it's a rental project or an ownership project, they have to complete that. And then the affordability by household income. So if it's a lower income project, then the jurisdiction needs to complete the unit mix. And then, so that's table A. That would be for every housing development application. The same project identifier information goes for table A2, which is any entitlement, building permit, or certificate of occupancy that has been issued for the project. So, you know, you can track these projects through. You can see, you know, one project maybe was submitted, you know, in a prior year, and then the next year it would in table A, you know, it would show up as an application. Table A2, you know, maybe it was actually entitled and approved and issued a building permit. It would show up on table A2. It's like moving through the pipeline, right? So we have these required fields for both tables, which have a lot of identifying information, particularly location information. So, you know, we think that this is, you know, very useful to be able to tell where, you know, residential development is occurring throughout the state. This is table A2. You can see it's really big. It's really hard to see, but it just, we just wanted to, you know, show the full scope of the table to show how much data, you know, we're able to capture. So the blue sections are all the project identifier information. The orange is the entitlement section. The yellow is the building permit section. And the green is the certificate of occupancy section. So, you know, you can sort of scroll, you know, to the right and fill it out as your project moves through the development pipeline. You can see our colors here. And like I said, everything is broken down by affordability. And then we also have, capture whether or not it's deed restricted or not. So if there's, market rate units for lower income being developed, jurisdictions can identify that, or if they're deed restricted. And then we have accompanying dates for everything. So, we're really capturing, quite a bit of information on our form. And like I said, it's all uploaded into our database. And from there, we can, write reports and whatnot to then extract, data in a raw format that can be more easily worked with than just a spreadsheet.
And Tom, this is Mike. If I could cut in for just a second, I meant to mention at the beginning, but everyone who registered for the webinar should have received a copy of that form along with the slides. So
yes.
If you want to dig into it a little bit more, then it's waiting for you in your inbox.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. There's a lot of different tabs. Each tab corresponds to a different table. So yeah, feel free to click through, and then there's the instructions are on there too. So, you can see a sort of a detailed description of the requirements of every field. And with that, I'll toss it over to Harrison, and he can go over the sites inventory.
Thanks, Tom. So another data set that can be used to show where housing might be sited in the future is the housing element sites inventory. Each jurisdiction is required to submit a sites inventory as part of their housing element. Housing element is the portion of the general plan where jurisdictions lay out their plan for accommodating housing need over the next 5 or 8 year period. And the sites inventory are those sites that are planned or zoned for housing where housing need can be accommodated. Right now, we have 5th cycle housing element data. That's roughly data from 2013 to the present for most jurisdictions, but that data set is unfortunately flawed. Local governments were allowed to adopt general plans in any format deemed appropriate or convenient per statute. So what we got was inconsistent reporting across jurisdictions, and further electronic reporting was not required. Fortunately, in 2019, last year, the legislature passed and the governor signed SB 6, which requires local governments to submit sites inventories electronically on an HCD form for housing elements adopted on or after January 1st, 2021. The legislation gave us form authority to create the form on which jurisdictions report their sites inventory, and it also gives us some consistency in what data is collected from jurisdictions and how it's collected. So right now we have we're working on a draft form that we expect to release later this year for your input, which allows jurisdictions to report their sites inventory information consistently, which should give researchers access to data that looks out a little bit further into the future on where housing may be located.
Okay, this is Sasha again. So that's, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Harry, for walking through some of the information that we're already collecting. I'm going to highlight some of the ways that we or others are already using the annual progress report data. I showed you the SB 35 map, or at least the snapshot of it. I'll show you it again in a second. But we use annual progress report data to evaluate how far along each jurisdiction or how much progress each jurisdiction, each city and county is making towards their regional housing need allocation. The law gave HCD the authority to make a determination to evaluate each jurisdiction's progress in meeting their goal. And if jurisdictions aren't keeping pace with their goal, then they lose some degree of local land use control, and specifically around the requirement to streamline housing developments that have a certain amount of affordability. So that's one application of the annual progress report data, really an applied data exercise that we do here in-house. Our team, our team broadly defined, we have an accountability and enforcement arm that I mentioned earlier on the call. That team will be looking at the program data that Tom mentioned that's in Table D. So it's a more narrative response from jurisdictions that are talking about their progress in meeting the programs which they committed to do in their planning cycle. Another way to use annual progress report data would be to look at permits as they're part of the housing development pipeline. This snapshot is actually from the governor's budget proposal, where we show 4 different components of the pipeline, which is what the housing goal is stated to be, the RHNA. This is statewide. What the zoned capacity is, so how much did the jurisdictions actually zone for? And then how many permits are issued and how many units were actually built. And so we talk about this as a development pipeline, but you can see that it's actually functioning more like a funnel or a filter. So we use the data which we collect to make that analysis. Going a little bit deeper into APR data, this is another snapshot from a table that's on our website. This permit summary uses some of the old permit data which we received under the older APR, which Tom touched on, and then the newer APR data which we're receiving. We're not looking at all the information that we collect, but rather the permit data. And that permit data is used as a proxy for progress towards meeting housing goals. So when SB 35 in the early stages of implementation, when that first kicked off, we realized we needed to daylight the information which we had to be able to let jurisdictions see what we had collected and then help us reconcile against their records. So this has been an iterative and comprehensive process at each step of the way. Daylighting the information, as well as having new authority to take away some local land use controls, really did a lot for our compliance rate. So we're not only collecting APRs because we need to, but jurisdictions are really wanting to submit. They have a clarified legal requirement to submit the annual progress report, whether or not they're a charter city. And then there's also some carrots that are on the table. Annual progress report submittals being a threshold item for certain funding programs. So all this to say, we decided not to stop at presenting permit information in a table, but went back to use that information and visualize it in a more digestible fashion. This is the same slide that I showed earlier, but just to give kind of context to what's in there. All of the permit data which we collect and is that we have as of about June of each year is used to make this determination for SB 35. It also includes housing element status. We would love your thoughts on the map, but we really want to spend some time just kind of planting seeds for potential uses for the annual progress report data and for the sites inventory.